happy Genetic Counsellors Day, and I'm so delighted that the genetic counselling profession is developing so well in South Africa, and it's still got so much potential that it's just great. Let me just start by saying Professor Jenkins was only appointed as professor in the 1970s, somewhere around there. And he then employed me quite soon after, but he employed me as a medical social worker to do research in his department. And as you know, we chose the topic of albinism, and I've been researching albinism for 50 years now. So in the beginning, I was just employed for that reason. But then he went to an international conference, actually. I don't remember where it was, in Tel Aviv, I think. And he learned that at the international conference that other genetics departments were starting genetic counselling clinics. At that point in Johannesburg, there was a small genetic counselling clinic run by the Professor of Anatomy, Professor Philip Tobias, and then the Professor of Psychiatry also was commenting on bipolar disorders and things like that, being genetic, and so he ran his little clinic. So there were some small scale clinics being run in Johannesburg at the time. And then Professor Jenkins came back and said, well, since he's got me, who's a social worker, and he realizes that genetic disorders had psychosocial issues, and he didn't want to treat it only as a medical condition, he wanted to have more than that. He would start a clinic, and he and I would do the counselling together. And so that's what happened. I soon realized that he had some difficulty with the psychosocial issues, and so we got in an excellent child psychiatrist who came and sat in on the sessions and commented on the way he handled the patient and what happened. And so between us, the three of us, we developed the clinic. Then what happened next was that we had a very interested and interesting student, a BSc honours student, who had heard about genetic counselling in the States. And so he said, well, was there any way that he could progress from a BSc honours degree to becoming a genetic counsellor? And he'd done a little bit, not much research, but a little bit of research to find out that that's what was happening, and he would have had to go to the States to train. And he said, well, can't we start the training here? So then I was going to go to at that point, I think I was going to an international conference anyway in the States. So I added on after the conference 3 different visits to prominent universities in the States. The main one being New York, one in New York, one in California, and another one somewhere. And because those were the key people training genetic counsellors then, I met the directors of genetic counselling training programs over there, and thought that we could modify their program for development in South Africa.
Is the New York one the Sarah Lawrence?
Yes,
okay.
I can't forget, but it is the Sarah Lawrence, that's right. Wonderful
So
program.
that was
the original,
program, yeah.
Exactly, and that's why I went to her, yeah. And so she was very interested, we had wonderful discussions, and I met some of her students and that sort of thing. It was great. And the California one followed after the Sarah Lawrence, and then I went to them too. So when I came back, we decided, Professor Jenkins and I, that we could work out a program and develop a syllabus and make it appropriate, and hopefully even make it acceptable in other countries, because it was based, and in those days only the United States was the only one country in the world training genetic counsellors in those days. So then we got, not only that same student was allowed to register, but we had a second person as well. So we had 2 students that first year. And we developed the course as it is run now, mainly with teaching, a lot of teaching, and then a lot of practical work. In those days, the teaching and the practical work ran concurrently, whereas now it's more like an internship at the end of the teaching. Yeah. So those first 2 students, we kept them for two or three years. they had to do, as well to meet the requirements of the university, they had to do a proper full-scale research project and produce a thesis, another thesis, a dissertation. And so it took them, in the end, 3 or 4 years, actually. So then we didn't take anybody else until we worked through those first 2 students. After that, we started taking students every second year. And then, as you all know, every year from then on. So that's how it developed in the beginning.
And did you run into logistical issues with the practical side of it? So getting the students into clinics, like how did you integrate them? Because you obviously didn't have genetic counsellors before.
No, that's right. So it was only me. And at that point or soon after, no, not much later actually, not a bit later, we started to work with the Health Professionals Council. And because we wanted to register, starting getting registered, and we knew that there was nobody to register, so we would have a grandfather clause, and we had about then I think at least 8 or 10 not genetic counsellors, people doing genetic counselling. They were in Cape Town. The one in cytogenetics was in Cape Town, and he was doing counselling for Down syndrome and advanced maternal age and things like that. There was one in Bloemfontein, and there were a couple of people around. In fact, yes, of course, there was a couple, 2 or 3 in Cape Town. And so and myself included, we were registered through a grandfather clause as genetic counsellors. And from then on, we could start getting genetic counsellors properly registered, which in South Africa was a step in advance of other countries, because in America wasn't registering their genetic counsellors properly at that point either. So we were quite ahead of the game in the world, in fact, in those days. So that's what happened. That's what happened next. That's right. We got people registered and got things sorted out.
And so that grandfather clause was based on your experience.
That's
so you
right,
didn't have to do any further training or... Okay.
No, exactly. But they were all people, we did expect them to all be working in clinics at least 1 day a week. And although the Chromis, like the man who was doing the cytogenetics, he worked in the lab.
Yeah.
But 1 day a week he would counsel patients, so that people, and other people who worked, one person was working in the Huntington's program, and she was counselling them in the Huntington's, so she was working 1 day a week in a clinical sort of environment, not, counselling people,
And how did it feel for you, Jenny? Because it's like, you have an interested student and they bring this information up and you make this plan to go and explore it. Was it very daunting for you, or was it quite exciting to...
That's interesting, an interesting question. I've often thought about what made me do it. And I'd never been to, I think that was probably the first time I'd ever been to America anyway. It was challenging, and I enjoy a challenge, and he was a good motivating student, but it was me basically taking the initiative in the end, you're right. And fortunately, Professor Jenkins encouraging me. He didn't come with me or do anything about it, but I initiated all the appointments in the States and that sort of thing. And in retrospect, it was good for my self-confidence, probably, and good for my competence, because I realized when I got there and had a chat with them that we were doing just what they were doing anyway. Without any training we were doing the genetic, because I'd read all the papers, and I knew exactly what they were doing there, and I knew what we were supposed to be doing here. And by then I had been to a patient counselling conference in the Netherlands, that I knew more about patient counselling, but I was always a medical social worker anyway, so I was always in the medical field, which helped from my basis quite a lot, And also Professor Jenkins was good at giving me free rein, I could do whatever I wanted to do and discuss it with him, and he generally approved, and I did whatever I wanted. And that was good for me because he was quite a laissez-faire head of department. And those of us who benefited by a laissez-faire environment progressed quite a lot. Whereas many other heads of departments are much tighter, keep a tight rein on their staff. He was only too pleased if I did something on my own and a PhD and whatever else I wanted to do. So that's how it works,
It's very admirable that you really took that on and made the profession what it is in the country today. How long were you involved in training students?
Well, probably till I left for Australia. So that was from only probably 10 years actually. The first student, I think, came in 89, and then in 99 I left for Australia. They offered me a job training students in Australia for a genetic counselling program in Australia. And so it was only 10 years actually, that's right. But during that time, it's interesting to follow up a few of the people who came through, you know, and one of them was Tina Vessels, who now runs the Cape Town program. So from my point of view, it was wonderful to see the progress, you know, of my students and the way they developed and the way things happened after that.
And what were the typical counselling cases that you took on?
Well, yeah, that's a very good question, because in fact initially it was probably prenatal diagnosis. And one of the studies I did, it wasn't in my PhD, but one of the studies I did at the time was a 10-year review of what we'd been doing on prenatal diagnosis, from the point of view of prenatal diagnosis, and published that in the ESMJ special issue. And for example, it was often happened because we were very small staff in those days. It was Professor Jenkins and a cytogeneticist, Professor Bernstein, and me, and then the lab people. That was it. So when Jenkins and Bernstein were overseas at a conference, I had to take the responsibility and carry the can. So, for example, and then in those days the hospital was just over the road, where they were doing the obs and gynae over there, and prenatal diagnosis. And so, for example, I remember
the hospital.
Yeah.
Okay.
I remember the obstetrician phoning me in a panic, because we'd sent him, our lab person had sent him a result of a very greatly raised alpha fetoprotein in the woman's amniotic fluid. And so he didn't know what to do. So then I had to tell him, well, you've got to terminate, this is really bad. And so then he said, okay, well, I must come over and talk to him. So we had a long chat, and it was actually an anencephalic. You know, it wouldn't have survived the pregnancy anyway. So then he said, all right, he's going to terminate, but I have to be there, because otherwise, what will happen if it's not? And we say it's an anencephalic. What happens if it's not an anencephalic? So I had to be there. So I was sitting on tenterhooks, watching the fetus come out, and it was a very severely affected anencephalic. And the mother was relieved she didn't have to go through that pregnancy at the end, and then discover it was an anencephalic, which only had 24 hours to live or whatever, you know. And the same thing happened in Down syndrome. For our first Down syndrome, we diagnosed it, and the cytogeneticist who was here at the time said I had to go with her to the delivery, because it was in Park Lane or somewhere, because she wanted to examine the baby and make sure she'd got it right. And I must be there too, so so I went to that delivery in the middle of the night too. That woman delivered rapidly and in the middle of the night. And the third example was the Tay-Sachs. So we had to deliver we did our first prenatal diagnosis of Tay-Sachs disease. And we did it here. We didn't send a copy it back over to the States, we did it here. And of course there's nothing to examine in the fetus then, but what we wanted to do is to get fresh blood from that fetus, so that we could make sure that that it definitely had Tay-Sachs. And again, it did, and we got everything right. So there was no doubt about it. So those are my first 3 experiences of prenatal diagnosis. And that was a genetic counsellor, if you could call me a genetic counsellor in those days. Really hands-on, you know, getting involved in every aspect of the thing, including deliveries. Yeah. After that, the gynecologists and obstetricians used to consult us. And I said, not necessary for me to come, you know, you can manage by yourself. Yes. So we didn't go again, but those are the first 3. After that, I did a huge lot of prenatal counselling, and at Barrow I used to do as many as 7 or 8 a day on a Thursday, you know, because they just lined up and I used to see them one after the other. But that was the best way of getting them some counselling, otherwise they would have had none at all. So that's what we did, and also, of course, went back to counsel them if the result was abnormal. And discuss the pros and cons of termination and all that sort of stuff. Yeah.
It was lovely that there was a lot of buy-in from the other doctors.
That's right, and that's what I wonder if I don't know. Obviously, don't know really what's going on at the moment, but because I've been out of it for a few years. But I do worry a little bit. There's not so much buy-in now. And there's not, I had really close contact with a lot of, and neurologists with the Duchenne muscular dystrophy, which phoned me, you know, do I think this is Duchenne muscular dystrophy, what must you do about it? Even from Windhoek, you know, I remember a phone call from Windhoek, you know, from all over Southern Africa.
Yeah.
And when Professor Jenkins and Bernstein weren't here, I took the questions and I answered the questions to the best of my ability. And that's how it happened, you know, that's what happened. And that was a privilege in a way, because now there's so many genetic counselors, you all have different aspects, and you maybe don't get the huge range of things that I had to see and had to do in those days. Yeah.
How are you feeling about where genetic counselling is in the country now? Is it what you had envisioned? How does it differ, if not?
Yes, no, it is what I had envisaged, I suppose. Really, I haven't thought about that sort of an answer to that question. Obviously, I've watched it going more and more into the cancer field, and bear in mind that when I was doing most of mine, there was very little cancer, and if there was any cancer, it was generally only the medical geneticist that handled it in those days. And there was very little known about genes for breast cancer and that sort of stuff, so that wasn't an option in those days. So it was a different profile of patients, basically, that I had dealt with in those days. But just as interesting, maybe even more interesting, because it was such a wide range. That's another thing I did want to say, that my genetic counselling really also included a whole lot of community work. So for instance, at Tay-Sachs, we did a Tay-Sachs screening at the local synagogue, which I don't know, well obviously it's not really necessary to do that anymore, but nevertheless we did that. And also, I mean, I used to write articles or get interviews with the popular women's magazines, so there was always something in there. And then also go and talk to, for example, all the nurses groups. I talked to the midwives groups every year, and to the orthopedic nurses every year, and of course to the basic third year, final year nurses, so that I don't know if they still get, and then of course we didn't have it, but now the medical students have a lot more teaching than they did. We only started it in those days, started medical student teaching. And so that's developed very nicely, and I hope that medical students now know more or less what to do and where to go. And that's the WITS medical students, but the trouble is we get students from elsewhere and then they don't know, so it is a problem, keeping the doctors informed. We did go and talk at GPs congresses. I used to go and do that too. And so, and the same with albinism, you know, we hope that people with albinism, but we know that they're not all coming for genetic counselling either. And they definitely would benefit. We're on a big drive to get all our people with an albinism member in the family to come for counselling. Because they definitely are not getting it from the other. We know we've got quite a lot of proof of that. Yeah. So,
well, touching on that, you brought your book. Do you want to show us a little bit about it?
Oh yes, might as well. Yeah, since it's here. Okay, there it is. I don't know if it can.
You can hold it up.
Oh, it comes in the photograph. Oh. Okay, well that's then. That's the final end, I suppose. Not the end, actually, of my research on albinism. 5 decades, not 5 years, 5 decades, 50 years basically, since 1971. Wow. That's when I first started looking at albinism. And the reason we chose albinism is because I was a medical social worker and I couldn't diagnose any genetic diseases when I first came. So Professor Jenkins and I decided the most obvious and easy one to deal with was this. And then when I went into looked at the literature and the papers, in those days, in the 70s, there was nothing written on albinism in Africa, nothing at all. So I've done all my master's and my PhD on albinism. And then finally put everything we knew into this book, which was published in 2018, and it covers albinism, as you can see from the title, the historical background, which we looked at right back to probably before the year BC. In fact, even BC, there's 1 or 2 reports from Italian philosophers, Roman philosophers in those days, who commented on people in Africa, but they looked white, and they were not from Europe. They were Africans, but they looked white, And these philosophers commented on them and wondered why that was the case. So there's the historical background, there's a geographic part to the book about the fact that it's more common in different places than in other places, and mainly in Africa, more common in Africa than other places. And the medical side of it, we've got chapters on the genetic and the psychosocial chapters in the book, so that it's a very comprehensive book written, and you can see it's quite weighty. So
was that a proud moment for you, Jenny?
Yes, no, it's great, I must say. I didn't think I was going to be able to do that, actually, because it was a real challenge. I thought, I know this time I've taken too big a challenge on. But we worked through it, I worked through it with my friend who was a PhD in the molecular lab, Prashila Manga, and she was fantastic at the computer work, because I'm not so good at the computer work. And also she wrote wonderful chapters on the molecular side of albinism and the genes for albinism. So it's a very comprehensive book covering all the different aspects we could think of at the time. Probably the only aspect that I regret that we don't have a chapter on is the ethics, ethical issues in albinism, which there are, and developing more nowadays, the ethical issues.
Well, I suppose you still have time to add to it.
That's true, I do.
and you've done some more research since it was published.
In fact, the recent paper that we've done, in fact, is an upgrade of the chapter here, is on the worldwide prevalence of albinism. And we've found that only 13% of countries have statistics on albinism, although every single country in the world will have people with albinism. People don't know a lot about it all over the world, and so that paper was published earlier, this year. That's right. Yeah.
So you're going to have to release a second edition.
Yeah, that's right. Well, that's true. We'll have to.
What are your hopes for genetic counselling in the future? You were here at its inception in this country, and you were very much the helping hand to get it established. What do you envision for it going forward? From my point of view, it sort of has got a bit away from the psychosocial issues, and it's a bit more into the technical issues of like breast cancer and the genes for breast cancer and that sort of stuff. And I'm a little disappointed that it's floating away a little bit from the psychosocial issues, which I think are very important and are not always well handled. And so that is my main concern. But I understand the demands, and the demands of the community, and the demand is more information on breast cancer. That's becoming more prominent as the molecular side of it gets understood. The counselling side has to keep up with it, and therefore we get clinics get snowed under by cancer issues nowadays, which is a pity, because then the other issues that I see as equally important are downgraded and become second-hand, and that's why suddenly you get no people coming with neural tube defects to the clinic to see you. Because the doctors out there think, oh, well, this is really a cancer clinic, and it gets a name for being more technical than I feel it should be. I still think that because of my background, I think that the psychosocial issues are very important. And when I talk to people out in the community, and some of my old patients that I occasionally bump into around the community, they're only too pleased that they saw us at a time when we were dealing with psychosocial issues as important, and saw them several times, and sometimes not to discuss the genetics at all, but just to discuss the psychosocial issues. So I think that falls by the wayside when the laboratory work becomes important. I mean, it has to become important, because we have to understand the basic of the disease, but it tends to take over, because then the patient doesn't understand the technical side and needs more explanation, and the psychosocial side of it gets sort of disappeared in the mess. Not really a mess. So you want a greater focus, or kind of a hanging on to the psychosocial aspects of genetic counselling.
Yeah, that's what I want. That's what I want.
That's
what I want.
bit.
That's right. Yeah, and I think that it's important, and I think that it's often downgraded because the medical side starts to take priority, and I understand that's what happens in a medical field, and we are in a medical field after all. Yeah.
Thank you. This was so lovely. I'm so glad I got to do this.